So I went, no, it'll be fine, just give us 2 seconds. By which time, Alistair Campbell had picked up all my gear that was lying about and hoofed it out of Tony Blair's office. So anyway, miraculously, I went to press the shutter again, and it flashed. And then I did one more, and that was it. That was my session over. 2 pictures of Tony Blair. But when I got back, and it was film days, so I could develop the picture, and then I printed it up, and I went, oh, that's quite interesting. That's quite an interesting, because I felt the mask had slipped. You know, the sort of character that is portrayed by politicians had slipped.
Do you think Tony Blair wears a mask?
Just a little bit, yeah. Well, politicians, I mean, they just put their mask on, don't they? But I felt as if there was a little bit of something had just slipped, and whatever came through, I think the director at the gallery saw something behind the mask and went, that's a real portrait. That's somebody who's been caught out a bit.
War veteran David Cruickshanks came to talk about his autobiography, Staying Alive. Available to buy at razorcuts.com. David is also an actor and comedian. To support this channel, click subscribe and hit the like button.
Okay, so we're here today with David Cruickshanks, who I would describe as a man for all seasons. You've got so many parts to your personality and your talents, David. Mainly we're here today to talk about your book, which is just launched, Staying Alive, which I think describes your experience in the Falklands War and how you, well, it says on the cover, how PTSD nearly stole my life. But you are also an actor and a comedy writer, and I have been lucky enough to attend some of your stand-up comedy, which is brilliant. Maybe you could give us a summary of what the book is about, David, in more detail.
Yeah, thanks for having me along to the podcast, Ian. I really appreciate that. Well, the book there's a lot about the Falklands War in it, but I think my PTSD, it's fair to say, started way earlier than that. It started in childhood. And what I would say is that, you know, growing up in a violent childhood and with violence around you, I think what's going to happen is, your brain's going to take a weird approach to that and try and protect you. And of course, then joining the Navy, my reason for joining the Navy was to run away from violence and a violent childhood, but then I found myself in the middle of the Falklands War as a teenager, and what that did was sort of exacerbate my PTSD. So it's been a long journey through PTSD, and the reason it's called Staying Alive, PTSD Nearly Stole My Life, is that despite PTSD, I feel as if I've achieved quite a bit in life as well. And so I've come through the ups and downs, but I haven't let it define me.
So I know what the acronym stands for, post-traumatic stress disorder, but what is PTSD?
Well, it's a good question, because I think we hear PTSD, those letters used a lot, and I think PTSD is a very individual thing. It's down to the individual. So although it's a mental health condition that has a name, I think you're going to have an individual response. It's going to be your own personal way of dealing with trauma. So to give you an idea, for me, PTSD for me at first was feeling a bit kind of uncomfortable in spaces like supermarkets or shopping centres, places where there's a lot of things going on in your senses, and your senses are getting a bit overridden by it all. And so the response, the mental response would be, I'm not comfortable, I feel a bit ill. And then the physical response is, well, are you scared? Do you need to run? So I'm going to increase your heart rate. I'm going to make you breathe more shallow so you're ready to sort of fight or flight. Or I might make you sweat. So it's a very physical response to thought processes that's going on in your head. And I think that was designed in our primeval brain to get us running out of danger. But unfortunately, our old part of our brain sees a supermarket in the same way as it sees a saber-toothed tiger, So you have that same kind of fight or flight response to something that most people just take for granted.
And this is a fairly uniform response for all sufferers of PTSD, because I know that you work with veterans who suffer from PTSD, don't you? So are these the same symptoms that crop up?
Yeah, I think they can be. I mean, people will have very specific triggers to these physical responses. So, for example, a lot of people will find it difficult to deal with a particular smell or a particular situation they're faced with. It will immediately trigger maybe something that happened in the past that was traumatizing. And smell is a huge part, I think, of what people go through in war. Smells can easily sort of trigger that brain's fight or flight response.
I think we've all had the experience of just walking down the street and smelling something, but it can evoke a pleasant memory as well, of course, and it takes you back in time, doesn't it? So I can only imagine how terrifying that must be if you are the victim of a trauma like that might have occurred in warfare.
Yeah, I think you're right. And you're right about the positive smells. For example, a favourite smell of mine is the smell of candy floss at the Links Market, and that takes you back to a time where you're having lots of fun, and you're probably spending a bit of money going on the waltzers or stuff like that. And then you get a candy floss, you think, oh, what a great day that was. Yeah. But some other smells, for example, the smell of bacon can often be very similar to the smell of burning flesh. And that can immediately trigger something. Goodness. So something as simple as having breakfast or going out for breakfast and smelling that could immediately trigger somebody into something that happened 20 years ago, you know.
So just before we came into the studio, we were talking about your personal diary, and you were reading a little passage from your diary. You would be 17 years old, I think. Right?
Yeah.
And that was your experience in the Falklands War, and it was interesting because you were saying that it bore no relation to the personal trauma that you were going through. You were more concerned about recording the drama around you. Would you care to read a little bit from your diary again, David?
Yeah, sure. I can absolutely do that, Ian. It's just about holding it together. The pages are. This diary is. 40 years old now, so I don't actually take it out much. In fact, I've never read anything aloud from this diary. But just looking back on it now, you're absolutely right. It very much deals with the overall picture and not the detail, and certainly not the emotions I was feeling at the time. So if we look at a date of the 23rd of May, so 1982, and that's 2 days after the landings began at San Carlos, which is where my ship was. So that's basically 2 days after the beginning of taking the islands back. So here's an entry from 23rd of May 1982. The fighting is getting worse. We had an attack on us today, but 4 out of 4 planes were luckily shot down. HMS Antelope was blown up, and we took her survivors off the ship on board. War is such a sick business. So, when you're on a ship, are you feeling terrified minute to minute, or are you just focused on doing the job that you've been tasked with? I think sometimes I wasn't having the physical experience of being terrified, but I was certainly having the thought process of, what would happen to us if a bomb hit us? In fact, I even after a couple of days in Bomb Alley, where we were under incessant Argentine bombing, I began to start praying. And the prayers at first were very sort of general prayers, dear God, please get me out of this, and I'll be the best person I ever could be as long as I survive. But then my prayers became more defined, and it was like, dear God, if the Argentine aircraft do land a bomb on us, please can you make it a little bit further away from me so that I can work out my escape route, and I'll be all right,
Very specific prayers.
Very specific prayers, yes. And we have a very unusual language. So some of the ship's parts are things like 3 Hotel Alpha and things like that would designate an action station. So I would have a plan marked out to go from 3 Hotel Alpha to, Zulu or something like that, just have my way out marked, which was kind of like the precursor to, as I got older, sitting in the back wall of a cafe looking at my exit strategy if I felt uncomfortable. So it was almost like I was always looking for an escape route.
My goodness. It's funny when we think of war, we think of men going to war, and of course women go to war as well. But we think of like grown men, burly men, and I saw those photographs of you, and you're just a wee boy, really, aren't you? And that is heartbreaking in some respects, because it's just wee boys that lose their lives for their nation. When you're engaged in a war and you're going off, I've always wondered if soldiers or sailors, do they question the validity of what they're doing, or is it just you don't have to think about it? How does that work? Do you discuss it, like, should we be at this war, or do you see what I mean?
Yeah. So I can't speak for other people in other wars. I felt in a way that the Falklands War was a just war. And from our point of view, and yes. And it's a bit like what's happened in Ukraine at the moment. So the Russians have invaded a country. People feel that's just completely not right. It's illegal. It's immoral. And I think for me, one of the, if you like, benefits of going to the Falklands was that it had been invaded by the Argentine junta, and people felt there was a necessary reason to go and fight what they thought was a just war. And I think as we've gone on in time, other wars may have had a slightly more dubious reason. And I think maybe, I don't want to speak for people who have served in the other wars, like the Gulf War, but there may have been that kind of concern over legitimacy, whereas I think we all felt that we were going down there to do a very specific task. Once that task was over, the Falkland Islanders would have their islands back and we'd come back. And I suppose it was quite neat. So there wasn't really a need to talk about, the reasons for going down there, because obviously it's a British overseas territory, and people thought that was the right thing to do.
I'm certainly in that camp, and I've always been left scratching my head when people question the validity of the what happened in the Falklands, because clearly people they don't like Margaret Thatcher, therefore anything that was actioned by her is bad. But for me, that was quite black and white. I mean, you just don't have the right to invade a sovereign territory, And
yeah. I think it's interesting what you said about Margaret Thatcher, because she's a very complicated character, and for a Scottish war veteran whose maybe political persuasion isn't to vote conservative, it is a confusing picture, So on the one hand, you feel she's sent you off to a justified war. On the other hand, you feel that the reason you're joining the forces sometimes for working class people is that there wasn't really those opportunities to go on and do other things in your life. For me, there probably would have been. I probably could have went to university, but my situation at home meant that I was kind of forced to make decisions that were about escape. So that was one reason for joining the forces. Yeah. But in terms of Margaret Thatcher, I think she's a really complicated character. And on the one hand, you have admiration for someone who decided to send a task force 8,000 miles away. But on the other hand, you're like, well, what she did to the miners was plainly awful, And coming from Fife, where there's lots of mines, you can see the conflict there, Well,
it's interesting because I think just about 10 days ago, you were telling me a story, which I'm going to ask you to tell me again, about going out in the little boat. And it makes me think, how bad were things in Fife when you were a lad that you had to join the Navy? so can you tell us? Can you tell us that story?
Yeah. So part of my job on the ship was, and it's actually it was the more interesting of the jobs I had in the Falklands. Was early hours in the morning, I would go into this little seaboat, and myself and this other sailor, we would potter around the ship. And we'd have a gun, an SLR rifle, and some stun grenades. Mm-hmm. And so we would putter around San Carlos Bay in the middle of the night. And so the first night, I didn't really know what we were doing. The guy that was in charge of the boat, he seemed to know what he was doing. So I kind of sat back and let him take charge of the boat. And we're just tootling round the ship, and I'm kind of looking around me thinking, oh, look at this, you know, all these ships in this tiny bay, you know. And I'm going into a bit of a daydream. And then the next thing, you know, I'm lifted, I'm physically lifted off the boat and plumped back down on the boat with a hard thump. And then I realised that the guy that's in charge of the stun grenades has thrown a grenade into the water, and the explosion has actually lifted me off. Luckily, it's lifted me vertically and put me back down in the same place. And I had no idea what was happening. I was like, would you mind telling me if you're going to do that, you know, to let me know?
Yeah, so that was a kind of a fun memory, I suppose, of a difficult time, isn't it?
Yeah, it was certainly, I wasn't expecting it, you know. I was just going into a bit of a daydream, you know, as a teenager, looking around going, wow, look at all this, look at all these ships, you know, against the night sky. And then I suppose it brought me right back down to the idea of why we were there in the first place, which was like, you know, guns and grenades, really, you know.
I mean, I made reference to, you know, you growing up in Fife, and you were talking earlier about, you know, the violence that you experienced. That's something that I can clearly remember. I'm a wee bit younger than you, but I remember clearly my environment being not my home environment, but certainly growing up in Fife, violence was an ordinary thing. It's every day at school, at weekends in the park. Did you experience that outside of the home as well?
Yeah, it just seemed to be everywhere. You know, violence just seemed to be everywhere. It seemed to be so acceptable, so part of your life, you know, that things were solved by violence, you know. And I can understand that when people are grown up, you know, there's a certain level of violence, but you kind of thought my idea at that time was people will grow out of this, and as I get older, I'm sure people will start to solve their problems without violence. But that wasn't the case. I mean, everywhere we looked, from even primary school, there was lots of people fighting for their place in the hierarchy, and that was like serious violence. I mean, you're talking kids 7, 8 years of age, you know, really, really physical violence, like pulling people's hair and kicking them in the face. And it's like, what is going on here? And I just couldn't get my head around it, you know. And then that kind of went into secondary school, and then some of the things you did on the weekends, you know, you'd maybe go out the weekends and you'd be coming home with your mum for the shop from where I was in Glenrothes, and then two guys would be falling out a pub door at somewhere like the Sizzle, and they'd be kicking into each other, and it's like, it's a bright sunny day, and here's these two people you know, knocking lumps out of each other. And like, what is going on here? You know,
I remember all that, but hopefully that's really come to an end now, because of course it's prohibited to spank your own children, and perhaps, you know, children, violence was normalised for children, and they just transferred it onto each other when they went, you know, out to school or out into the wider world.
Yeah, I mean, it just seemed to be a problem. So it was a quick way to solve an issue, to shut someone up. I always remember one of the things that really, really, you know, traumatised me as a kid was, I remember my granny lived in Glasgow, and we would all traipse through there, and it was like, you know, one bus, 3 trains, another bus, you know, to get to my granny's in the East End of Glasgow. And I loved to go and see my granny. She was a very gentle woman, but I had an auntie that wasn't quite as gentle. You know, when Billy Connolly talks about aunties, I immediately think about this auntie. But I distinctly remember walking down the street in Shettleston, and I must have said something. I must have been about 5 or 6 years old, no older than that. And suddenly I felt this hard slap on my face, and it just completely took my breath away. And I think even at the age of 5 or 6, I knew that was wrong, you know, and I obviously really, really internalized that trauma, even at that age. But I knew that was wrong. You know, I knew somebody had done something really bad to me, you know, but then I suppose your brain kind of normalizes it, because if that's happening a lot and you see it around you, you think, well, that's just life, isn't it? Because you only get one childhood.
Well, I always thought that, you know, if you get into your 20s and you feel fine, then that's, you know, whatever happened to you before doesn't matter. But these things can come back to haunt you much later in life, even in your 40s or 50s. Yeah, and
Yeah.
that's the essence of trauma, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
You have to address it at some point.
Yeah, and it gets, I suppose, that kind of, now that I'm working with veterans, you know, I see that. I see people presenting in their 50s and maybe in their 60s that are saying, you know, today I just suddenly felt like crying. That's never happened to me before. And you're like, well, I understand, you know, and that's okay. And this is quite normal, because once we start talking about your life, we might find reasons for it. And I think people are looking for reasons of why these things suddenly come on. So it is, I think you're right. We kind of think, oh, we'll grow out of that. And I think the language people used is man up, or, you know, get on with it, pull your socks up. It's all that kind of language. But your brain won't let you do that, because it realizes something needs looking at in your mental health, you know. And until you start investigating and you start getting support and whatever works for you, it could be therapy, it could be medication, it could be a combination of both. But until you go down that journey, you're always going to be thinking, what's going on with me, you know?
Yeah. So would you like to read a passage from your new book?
Yeah, thank you. So this, all the chapters are named after Jam songs, because I was a huge fan of the Jam growing up, and I was very lucky to see them a couple of times. In fact, I was all ready to see them in Edinburgh Playhouse when I ended up going down the Falklands, so I've still got the ticket stub with both bits on it that I've kept. I'm a bit of a hoarder of concert tickets. But anyway, this chapter is called A Town Called Malice, and it's 1981. Every sailor, no matter how bright or stupid, does basic training. That's why they call it basic. The transformation from schoolboy to sailor begins the second I walk through the gates at HMS Raleigh, a shore establishment with a ship's name. It's the last time for 6 weeks that I'll be walking anywhere for a while. Raleigh is a chain-link ferry away from Plymouth, a sprawling, vibrant navy town with the promise of an alcohol-fueled good time made to every passing Jack the Lad. But for the 6 weeks I spend in basic, it might as well be on Mars. I arrive at Raleigh on March the 2nd, 1981. Funny how you never forget these things. It's cold and damp, and it's determined to remain like that for 42 days. I lose count of the number of soakings I get, on the parade ground, in the shower with my clothes on the cross-country field. The Cornish rain permeates my 16-year-old bones and never leaves. Cornwall is where I discover my love of alcohol, balanced only by my hatred of the stuff. It's where I encounter mindless cruelty, unconditional friendship, tap water shits, and my first hangover. I realise very quickly that at 5 feet 6 inches and weighing less than 9 stone, I feel vulnerable. But my dad's constant bullying has made me wary of making friends too easily, of giving up too much of myself only to be shot down in flames. I'm determined not to forge friendships without playing a game of mental chess first. Hierarchies during basic training establish themselves as naturally as newly formed lava cooling on the side of a volcano. Leaders emerge. They aren't picked. I've been selected for Anson Division, which I hope isn't like being picked for Balfour, the shittiest house at my primary school. Our instructors, who are all seasoned petty officers and have years of understanding Darwinian evolution, are primed to sit back and wait for the survival of the fittest gene to emerge. They rarely interfere with the natural order of things. My first experience of how not to survive basic training is on the parade ground, where somehow everyone has miraculously learned to march without any training whatsoever. I, on the other hand, must have slept through these instructions, as when it comes to stepping off, I tick-tock like a windmill in full sail until the drill officer squeals our division to a halt. Divisions. That word still sounds like fingernails dragging across a blackboard to me. Tick-tocking is when your right arm and right leg move forward together instead of your right arm and left leg. I know it sounds simple, but to me it might as well be rocket science. If I can't march in sync, I can't pass out, and if I can't pass out, I can't be in the Royal Navy. Not just me, though, my whole class. I'm oblivious to the hatred that's festering towards me by the rest of my intake. I build my shoes, clean my kit, have the obligatory crew cut to foster solidarity, eat, drink and joke with my new shipmates, blissfully unaware that I'm about to endure several nights of organised thuggery. I'm blissfully unaware of the first nighttime assault until the next morning. In the middle of the night, 4 of my classmates, hidden behind makeshift masks, had tried to turn my bed upside down with me in it. Apparently, I had sat up like Linda Blair from The Exorcist, minus the revolving head, screamed at the top of my highest tenor voice, and then went back to sleep. The invaders were so terrified, they all ran off. I only found this out in the mess hall at breakfast the next day from a mate who had been woken by my screams, just in time to catch some of the X-rated action. The increasing pressure for me to perform on the playground is taking its toll on my health. There was a rubella epidemic in week 3, just before some of the most important tests like swimming and gas mask, which have already instilled an irrational fear in most of us. This is partly due to exaggerated stories of those who have gone before. My imagination is both a blessing and a curse, and I begin to dream of drowning in the swimming pool wearing my gas mask. I'm sure others dreamed of similar things. There's always some new recruit shuddering and shaking in their bed, and it isn't all masturbation.
That's extremely well written, and it sounds like your night terrors saved your bacon.
I think so, yes. Yeah. It's quite amazing that something like waking up in the middle of the night screaming is actually going to save you from a beating.
Yeah. Great. So after you came out of the Navy, what then?
Yeah, so I came out of the Navy. I had an injury to my knee, and it went through surgery, and it didn't really work. But what happened was the Navy had forgotten the physiotherapy side. They could do the surgery bit, but they never thought about aftercare. So I wandered about with a limp for 2 years, wondering where my life was going. And luckily for me, they did do a bit of resettlement, and I found myself working in the unemployment benefit office in Glenrothes, where I didn't have a clue what I was really doing. In fact, I remember somebody coming in and saying, am I going to get benefit this week? So off I went to do my little benefit calculations. And then I said, yeah, it looks like you're going to get paid this week. So off they went, and then I went to see my manager, and I says, have I done that right? Is that person going to get benefit? And they went, no, they're not going to get benefit for a fortnight. So I realised I was definitely in the wrong job. So calculating benefits definitely was not my strong point.
Right.
So then I saw an advert in the local Fife Free Press, the newspaper, and it was like trainee photographer wanted. And I'd been taking pictures since about the age of 11, and I was given a proper camera when I was 12 years old. And I just fiddled about with it. I mean, I was pretty awful, to be honest, at taking pictures. But then I just thought, well, in for a penny. So I sent away my portfolio, and I got an interview, and I was completely shocked about getting an interview. And then the chief photographer, a guy called Bill Dickman, who I owe a tremendous amount to, he said, right, son, I'll take you to this football match and see how you get on. So I took all these pictures at a football match, and we went back to the Fife Free Press and developed them. And he showed them to me, went, right, that's no very good, that's okay. You need to get the players a bit closer together. And so I immediately thought, well, it sounds like an epic fail. You know, he's kind of letting me down gently. So I went back to work on the Monday at the unemployment benefit office. And then I got a call from my mum, and she said, you need to come home for your lunchtime. This chief photographer guy's sitting here waiting for you. And I went home, and he went, oh, I just want to offer you the job as a trainee press photographer at the Fife Free Press. And I was like, wow, this is brilliant, you know.
Well, and now you have portraiture hanging in the National Portrait Gallery.
Yeah, how on earth did that happen? And that's one of the things about mental health is, you know, when someone says to you, I remember getting the call from the director at the gallery in London, and he said, can you come in? We want to discuss your Tony Blair picture. Mm-hmm. And I went, oh, that's interesting. You know, so I think a newspaper phoned me and asked me to do a job, and I kind of made one of those decisions where you're like, oh, there's money on the table, but there's also a chance to go and see the director of the National Portrait Gallery. So luckily for me, I made the right decision. And I went to see him and he said, oh, I would like to buy your Tony Blair picture that you took and hang it in the National Portrait Gallery's permanent collection. And of course, the money was terrible. I think they paid me £70 for the picture, but it's in their permanent collection. So I was pretty chuffed about that.
And how did that happen, that portrait?
Yeah, I think it was one of those things where you wouldn't take no for an answer. Yeah. So there were some days I shot portraits where I kind of gave up quite early and thought, oh, this is not happening. But I was, it was the Herald newspaper had sent me to Millbank, and it was then a couple of days before Tony Blair's second term as Prime Minister. And I think Labour was actually a bit worried about the polls. So they went on a bit of a charm offensive. Mm-hmm. They called in all the newspapers to do interviews. So I was there as a photographer. So I arrived at Millbank, and I arrived early. I arrived an hour early. To get my stuff, my photographic equipment through all the scanners and everything, and then up to see Tony Blair. So the journalists were there, and they were all quite pally with each other, and I was like, that's a bit weird, you know. So I just took lots of pictures as they were chatting, and Alistair Campbell was in the background, kind of growling as he does. Mm. And then after it, I just chanced my arm, and I had my lights up, and I had my cable attached to the camera and attached to the lights, and everything had been working perfectly up until then. And then I just cheekily asked Tony Blair if I could do a portrait, and I said, it'll only take 2 minutes. And Alistair Campbell said, it'll not take 2 minutes, it'll take 30 seconds. And I went, okay, fine. So I went to take his picture, and the lights stopped working. The synchronization cable had just stopped working. And I'm like, what am I going to do? So I just started waffling about, oh, how's things, Tony? And do you remember when you were up in Glasgow, I took your picture? And he's like rabbit caught in headlights. His eyes are all over the place, kind of like, what am I doing? What's this guy doing? And then the journalist said, oh, I think we've taken up too much time with Tony Blair's. We really must get going. And I'm like fizzing, because I'm like, you should be on my side. You should be like, oh, David's just had a technical issue, he'll fix it. And she's like, oh, we really must get going, he's had enough. I was like, that'll be right. You know, I think the fife came out in me then. I was like, that'll be right. So I went, no, it'll be fine, just give us 2 seconds. By which time Alistair Campbell had picked up all my gear that was lying about and hoofed it out of Tony Blair's office. So anyway, miraculously, I went to press the shutter again, and it flashed. And then I did one more, and that was it. That was my session over. 2 pictures of Tony Blair. But when I got back, and it was film days, so I could develop the picture, and then I printed it up, and I went, oh, that's quite interesting. That's quite an interesting, because I felt the mask had slipped. You know, the sort of character that is portrayed by politicians had slipped.
Do you think Tony Blair wears a mask?
Just a little bit, yeah. Well, politicians, I mean, they just put their mask on, don't they? But I felt as if there was a little bit of something had just slipped, and whatever came through, I think the director at the gallery saw something behind the mask and went, that's a real portrait. That's somebody who's been caught out a bit. And it just happened because the camera gear had failed. But I was so livid at the journalist that I was like, I'm sticking this out until I get a picture.
Absolutely. What struck me when I saw the photograph was how much younger he looks then than now. And he seemed to age quite quickly in the sort of latter years of his premiership.
Yeah, I think I mean, they're under tremendous pressure. I mean, I have to understand that, but obviously the whole war situation, the Iraq war, I'm sure that was his moment where I think up until then things had probably been going quite well for Tony Blair. you know, but I think that was his defining. When you've got 1 million people marching through London saying not in my name, you know you've not exactly got everybody on board. And I think there was probably, I mean, I can't speak for him, but just as a human, you're going to have some sleepless nights debating, you know, if you're doing the right thing or not, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. So in your 50s, David, I hope you don't mind me betraying your age, but you got into stand-up comedy. And how did you make the transition from, you know, being a press photographer to a stand-up comedian and a comedy writer?
Just through absolute anxiety, social anxiety. I think my anxiety was getting to such a stage where I was struggling to function. You know, I was a freelance photographer, so I was going to lots of networking meetings, and I was feeling uncomfortable, and I don't know what was going on in my head, but I felt as if a lot of my panic and my anxiety was featuring heavily in my life. I think it's because I was a bit worried about the job as a photographer, because it just wasn't getting the gigs. And mobile phones were out and about, and, you know, people weren't paying. There just wasn't enough money in what I was doing. And I thought to myself, I have to find something else. I have to beat this anxiety. That was my thought. I have to beat this anxiety. And again, some things just happen. It must have been on social media, but there was a group in Bells Hill, and they were running courses for people who suffered from anxiety. And the courses were learn the guitar, learn to write, or learn to do stand-up comedy. And I thought, what's the thing I probably fear most is probably standing on a stage and trying to make people laugh. So I went along to this group, and everyone there had a mental health issue, which was great because we were kind of all in it together. But I think the thing that really made me relax was the other guy who'd plumped for the stand-up comedy writing thing was so physically nervous. He was shaking. And I think my empathy for him and how badly he was dealing with the situation kind of made it feel a bit easier for me. So he went on and he did about a minute or something, and then he just said, that's enough. And I think just because I'm quite competitive as well, so the competitive thing was, right, I need to do the 2 minutes here. I need to make this work. And my mum had just been actually attacked by a seagull in Kirkcaldy, and she'd had a heart attack as a result. And it's the sort of thing you look back on and you laugh, because what are the chances, you know? And I just got up and I did 2 minutes about my mum being attacked by a seagull and having a heart attack, and I made it through the 2 minutes. And one of the things about anxiety is the fear of dying. And I thought, well, I've done one of the most stressful things ever, and I haven't dropped dead of a heart attack. So what's the worst that can happen the next time?
Yeah. Aye, so and you write jokes for the BBC sometimes as well, don't you?
Yeah, and I got into that in a strange way. I heard this show, and I know, and everybody out there, this is not the way to endear yourself to to the BBC, but I decided to do it my way. There was a show on Radio 4, a comedy show called, well, I've said it, I'm going to say it, So On and So Forth. Okay, I've done it now. And it just didn't feel... The jokes just weren't strong enough. It just felt like a lot of posh people talking in very strong, you know, important and very confident voices. And I was like, I don't think this is very good. So I tweeted that I didn't like it. And out of the blue, the producer of that show contacted me, and he tried to give me a hard time. And I was like, but I think I could do better. And he was like, okay then. So he said, I've got a show coming up in a couple of months. Let's see if you can do better. And you know, time went by, and I just thought I'd forgotten about that. And then I thought, oh, it's getting close to Christmas. I think I'll email that guy. And I emailed him, and he went, oh, that's coincidental, because I was just thinking about getting in touch with you to write some jokes. So I wrote some jokes for this show called Wired News, BBC's Wired News, and bearing in mind, I'd never done this before, and I just wrote sketches. And it was aired on the Friday, and I had like 3 sketches in, and nobody had told me. I was like, oh, wait a minute, maybe I can do this, you know. And then the following week, I think I had 1, and then the following week I had 2, and then the final week I had 2. And I was like, well, the first one wasn't a complete fluke, so maybe I can do this. And then the show, unluckily for me, only had 1 series you know. But then a new show came in, Breaking the News with Des Clark, and I thought, well, I'll just give that a go. But it is a case of you write your jokes, you send them in, and if you get a hit, that's great, and you get your money. But it's still good to keep on writing the jokes anyway, and to keep your brain active. And one thing I did learn, because I was giving myself a hard time about not getting jokes in the show, and then I found out that you've got a 1 in 200 chance, so it's a little bit like winning the lottery. So,
well, you've done exceptionally well.
Well, thanks.
But I mean, you've had an incredible life, you know, starting with the Navy, and then press photographer, and photographing Prime Minister, and then, you know, comedy writer and stand-up comedian. It's an astonishing story, isn't it? Does it amaze you as much as it does me?
I guess it doesn't. I guess I think that one of the things in mental health that's very difficult to pull yourself out of is that idea that you could do better, that you could be better, that you're not quite done enough. I think you do. I'm very good at saying to other people, you're doing great. Give yourself a pat on the back. But I think one of the things that's very, very hard as a striver, you know, I think my way of dealing with my mental health is to strive and to be better. And it's like, that's why I look at people like Elton John, and Elton John to me is a man who's done the most incredible things, yet I don't think it sits well with him. It's like, I could always play the piano better, I could always sing better, and sometimes that's the way I feel. So I think it's nice that people say to you, I think you've done great, because maybe you do sit back and go, yeah, maybe I have done all right. You know, maybe a wee guy from Glenrothes and Fife.
Yeah. Well, I think that's one of the things that I really like about you is your humility, and you're very down to earth, and as I'm sure you can appreciate. I encounter many creative people, artists and musicians, and the best among them have your attitude. They're very modest, and they have a very sober, industrious approach to what they do. So it is consistent that you are the way you are, despite all your accomplishments. But so, I mean, it's been fantastic talking to you, David. And could you tell the people listening where they can buy your book, Staying Alive? Yeah,
of course. And as you said, like all people like myself, I have absolutely no idea where to get this book apart from on the Razor Cuts website.
Okay. Yeah.
So hopefully it'll be like www.razorcuts.com, and then there'll be a link to the book, Staying Alive. The guys at Razor Cuts have been absolutely amazing. And the editor, Dixon Telfer in particular, has really dragged me through this process to get this book finished. So I really do thank Razor Cuts and Dixon for getting this book out. But yes, you can get it at the Razor Cuts website at the moment, and hopefully you'll really enjoy it.
Well, we'll put a link as well to that website so that people can buy it, and wish you every success with it. Thanks so much for coming in.
Thanks very much. Really enjoyed it.